Greetings and welcome to another episode of Two Bald Guys. In fact, our first episode of 2021. My name is Eric Giordano, and I am the Executive Director at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. And a special Happy New Year to my co-host Dave Anderson and our producer Lucas Rudolph.
Thank you, Eric. And indeed, I am Dave Anderson, a Senior Policy Fellow here at WIPS, and Happy New Year to you as well. We've got a great show lined up for you today with one of our favorite guests, who will be discussing the history of presidential transitions, insurrections, and last week's unrest at the U.S. Capitol. For those not familiar with WIPS, we're a unit of the University of Wisconsin system, founded in 2007, with a mission to educate and engage citizens, develop future leaders, and bring the resources of the university to address community-identified needs.
Thanks, Dave. And I'm really glad that we all made it through 2020. It was really snip and tuck at the end there. And I have an important New Year's resolution I want to share with everybody. I am resolved that this year on Two Bald Guys, I am only going to tell certifiably funny jokes. That's right. I am going to knock your locks off by overcoming my urge to shear really bad hair puns. Did you get all that, Dave?
I got it.
So this kind of leads me to my second New Year's resolution. I resolved to create a trivia show for rednecks where wrong answers cost them their hair, and I'm going to call it Mullet Over. What do you think?
Mullet Over, Eric.
Yeah, get it?
Well, mullet over. It sounds to me like you're off to a pretty rocky start for 2021. But remember, Eric, a wise person always shaves a little for the future. Get it? Shaves a little for the future. Speaking of the future, though, I too have a New Year's resolution that I'd like to share as well. Do you want to hear it? Excellent. Well, I'm going to tell you what it is anyway. And you know, being the kind of person that I am, I've been visiting some of the fashion and style websites this last week, just trying to get a handle on what's trending for 2021. And I came across a site that said a great suggestion for a New Year's resolution is to master some new hairstyling techniques. So I'm going to learn how to create a bouncy blow dry at home and learn to curl my hair with a hair straightener, something that I understand is being done a lot these days. So what do you think about that, Eric?
Dave, I suggest you hold on really, really tightly to that thought. Just keep holding on, my friend. And by the way, if our viewers have any words of wisdom of their own, including a hair-raising pun or joke, they may share it in a Facebook chat today with us, or they can email it to us at info@wips.org. That's info@wipps.org. And it is now time to acknowledge and thank our incredible producer, Luke Rudolph, who is also our new marketing coordinator at WIPS. So Luke, how's the new year going for you so far? And did you make any interesting resolutions?
Well, hey guys, Happy New Year and Happy New Year to all our viewers. New Year's has been going great for me. I did make a new resolution. I want to have a lot more stress in this new year so I can start to lose my hair so I can hopefully become, the third bald guy.
Excellent. You get props for that, Luke. Congratulations, and I hope you succeed. I think.
Oh my gosh.
Well, Dave, I think it's time really to get right to our special guest today, and our topic is election transition, turmoil, and historical perspective. And we have an outstanding guest that we want to remind viewers that if you have questions for our guests during the show, please feel free to ask them in the Facebook chat section. Dave?
It really gives me a great pleasure to welcome back to our show Dr. Brett Barker, Professor of American History at UW-Stevens Point. Our most faithful viewers will remember that Dr. Barker was our very first Two Bald Guys guest, in which he spoke about the 1918 Spanish flu and its parallels to our current pandemic. So welcome back, Dr. Barker. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be back.
And I'm going to jump right in with a question about the current transition that we're going through. We'll be facing this next week. How does this transition of presidents compare to historical transitions of power? Have we seen anything comparable to what we've seen unfold here just recently?
In its full splendor, I'm not sure we ever have. There are elements I can certainly see some parallels. If until students' history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot. I do see some parallels, and certainly there have been more contested elections. Election of 1876 could be one that we could talk about, and there have been certainly hard feelings and certain transitions, but uh, this one, in some ways, is probably unprecedented in the scope of its length and the fact that in some ways it's still not resolved to in a lot of people's minds. There's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of doubt about next Wednesday, and I think that probably is largely unprecedented in our history.
Uh, I wondered, as sort of a bit of a follow-up to that, would you like to share a little bit about that whole situation in 1876 and 1877? Because I'm sure it's been out in the news a little bit now, but I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that set of circumstances.
Yeah, I see a little bit more about it in the news lately, particularly because Lindsey Graham invoked it in his speech on the floor when he was talking about the Electoral Commission. So in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, faced Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and in a very close election, it came down to 20 electoral votes. When the dust had settled, Samuel Tilden was one electoral vote short of winning the presidency. Uh, uh, Hayes was 20 short, and there were 20 disputed electoral votes. And most of those came from three southern states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, where Reconstruction governments, that is, Republican state governments imposed by the North at the end of the war, those that had been allowing African Americans to participate in government, there were still three of those in charge, but the white Democratic South, which was the white supremacist South, the old guard, were trying to take control back of those states, and conflicting electoral votes were sent to Washington. So unlike in this year, it's not that one set was set and some people objected to them. In this case, there are actually two sets sent, one by the Republicans in each state, one by the Democrats, and the government and the Congress had to decide it. And after a lot of detail we won't go into, they eventually had an electoral commission. They came up with what was called the Compromise of 1877, which is Hayes would be awarded all 20 electoral votes. The Republicans would win the election. And in return, Hayes promised to remove remaining U.S. troops from the South and essentially let white supremacists take control back of the South. And that's largely the way it remained for 100 years. And any gains gained by the freed people during Reconstruction were slowly eroded thereafter. That was very contentious, so much so that when Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, March 4th, which was then Inauguration Day, fell on a Sunday, he was quietly inaugurated on March 3rd, just so that there was, in case there had been any attempt to disrupt the inauguration, he would already have taken the oath of office. And so that was very contentious, but in the end, the United States moved on from Reconstruction as a result, abandoning blacks in the South as part of the collateral damage of that election, though.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And it's interesting to hear, we of course know the disruption and the sort of turmoil that we're facing today, but it's hard to sort of imagine what it might have been like then. And so I was really interested to hear that they had concerns too about disruptions around the inauguration. Um, Speaking of disruptions, so protests and rioting even sometimes it seems to be really a part of the American DNA, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of this over our history. And that said, we want to know, Dr. Barker, how unusual was the citizen assault on the Capitol on January 6th?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So, your first part of your question is absolutely correct. Although Americans like to think of ourselves as sort of law abiding citizens who sort of get along and go along, we have a long history of disruptions, of riots, of mob action, and the like. That is perhaps baked into our DNA, as you suggest. But what happened with the storming of the Capitol, that is unprecedented. That did not occur during the Civil War, that has not occurred at other times. There has never been a sort of armed attempt to disrupt the democratic process of the United States on the national level. In that way, what we saw last Wednesday was absolutely without precedent in our history. Um, and we'd have to really go back to the Revolution to think about a time in which there was that sort of an uprising, and that, of course, was the colonists themselves rising against Great Britain. But since the foundation of the Republic, there really is no parallel.
Thanks. And speaking of unprecedented, we understand that the outgoing president, President Trump, is not going to be attending the inauguration. And so I wondered, is that unprecedented? Unprecedented? Have we seen that before?
It is not unprecedented. In fact, this will be the 6th time during a regular inauguration. Now, we have to understand that when presidents have taken over in more informal, when there's been a death of a president, of course, that's not a formal inauguration. But these classic events that occurred on March 4th until in 1937 and then January 20th since, those have not been attended by the previous president on 5 previous occasions. And they're for a variety of reasons, although I would say that in at least 3 of the cases, I think they're somewhat similar, that the outgoing president feels some anger towards the election, towards the process, towards his successor, towards the other party. And so those are somewhat similar. It happened first off in 1801. John Adams, the Federalist president, was not reelected, and Thomas Jefferson, the Jeffersonian Republican, was elected instead. Adams did not attend Jefferson's inauguration. There was a real falling out between the two, which is ironic and somewhat sad, since they had been through the Revolution together. They've been 2 of the 5 men who had drafted the Declaration of Independence, but they had really had a falling out in the 1790s. They did reconcile later in their lives, though, but they did. In 1829, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, did not attend the inauguration of Andrew Jackson, probably for many of the same reasons. John Quincy Adams, very different in political style and in persona than Andrew Jackson, and he did not attend. Interestingly enough, I looked long and deep, and no one seems to know why Martin Van Buren did not attend William Henry Harrison's inauguration in 1841. He simply didn't. The other, probably one of the better known examples, is Andrew Johnson did not attend Ulysses S. Grant's inauguration in 1869. Johnson had been impeached. He had had a falling out with Grant over the events that led up to the impeachment, and he was very upset at the Republican Party, and so he did not go. The other one, I'll admit, the 5th example is a bit of a trivia fact. It's in 1921. Woodrow Wilson was physically unable to attend William Harding's inauguration. He had had a stroke previously, had recovered somewhat, but was still in frail health. And he was present in Washington, but they felt he should not go outside for the actual ceremony, because that was just he was in quite frail health. He lived a few more years, but his health was really broken by the stroke. So it's not unprecedented, but it is unusual. And so the fact that it has not happened in 100 years, and except for that was really Wilson's health, it really hasn't happened in nearly 150 years, makes it quite unusual.
Well, that mystery of Martin Van Buren is going to just haunt me.
Well, it probably should. Yeah.
Get right on that, Eric.
Yeah.
We'll look for an update next week when we come back. I've had the good fortune in my lifetime of having attended 4 presidential inaugurals, and I've often said that there's really nothing quite like it. It's been really interesting watching the preparations for this inauguration on television, with the heightened security and the barricades and all of the precautions that are being taken, but
Dave,
not unusual.
Yeah, Dave, I have a question. So in background here, I have Lincoln's second inaugural in 1865. Were you at that one?
Yeah, right. You might think that I was.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
sorry.
Good one, Brett. Thank you so much.
I missed that one. But I have to say, my wife loves the inaugural parade. She, as do I. Who doesn't love a parade, right? 2 of the 4 times, we purchased grandstand seats so we could really get a good view of the parade. And those 2 times we were barred from getting to the grandstand because of protest activity and barricades, and the decision was made actually not to let people through the various checkpoints. So I totally agree that what we're seeing in preparation for this year is certainly unprecedented in terms of its scope and scale. But even in recent memory, I mean, there have been lots of instances where people have exercised that constitutional right to express their views on a variety of topics. You know, which leads me to the question for you, Dr. Barker. Is there anything particularly noteworthy about inaugurations? In other words, is it just the simple act of swearing in the next president, or are these events really consequential in the big
Yeah,
scheme?
I think that is a historical development. The founders did not think they were going to be a big moment. Uh, the first few inaugurals were not big events. In some ways, it's not surprising that Adams was not there because of his feelings, because it was almost a private event. It was really the only thing that the Constitution says that has to happen is really that the president and vice president need to take the oath of office. Beyond that, everything we have surrounded it with in the intervening years is really Americans' love of creating spectacle around these sort of hallmarks of our democracy. The inauguration itself was really not even an event until 1829. It's really Andrew Jackson when he enters the presidency after the election of 1828. Thousands of his followers who had, unlike, you have to remember, Jackson's the seventh president, is as someone who was born poor, he's orphaned at an early age, he'd really worked his way up through. And so he had a connection with ordinary Americans that the first six didn't have. The first six presidents, after all, are two Adamses and four wealthy Virginia planters. And so they did not resonate with ordinary people. But in 1829, Andrew Jackson, ordinary men really connected with him, and they showed up by the thousands to see him inaugurated. And that is really the beginnings of what has become much more elaborate. It's interesting that for much of our history, the president gave his inaugural address before taking the oath of office, and it's only really later that he that it became customary for the president to take the oath first and then give the inaugural address. And so, and things like the parades and the like are things that we've added on. But so it's all a decision we've made as a people that it should be. And I think that what we're trying to do is celebrate exactly what we're talking about today, the peaceful transfer of power. That as a nation, we decided early on that that's what we were going to do. We were going to have free and fair elections, and then we were going to have a peaceful transfer of power. The military wasn't going to be involved. There weren't going to be coups and the like. And I think that's what people want to celebrate on January 20th.
Oh. Eric, I see we might have a viewer question. Maybe we could have Luke let us know what that question is.
Sure. So our viewer would like to know, can you speak to the transition process from one administration to the next? How have they changed over the decades?
Well, what's interesting is that's another thing that's a historical development. And partly it's because transferring the executive branch is now a very complicated process because the executive branch itself has grown in size and scope over the last, particularly in the 20th century, it grew by leaps and bounds. You have to remember, Washington's first cabinet included three cabinet members and an attorney general who was supposed to be part-time. It was assumed that the attorney general of the United States would have enough business for a full-time job, and he would have a law practice in the afternoons. Think about what the executive branch of the federal government now encompasses. It is now a very complex. We've also become much more sophisticated in things like records transfer and records preservation. There are so many more people now involved, and there's so much more level of security involved. I presume that for much of the 19th century, new clerks simply walked in and took over the jobs of the old clerks or whatever. And now you can imagine the layers of passwords and security clearances and the like. So it's now become a process that, ironically, this transition obviously happened sort of late and has been difficult. But I remember that 4 years ago, and it's always a little more complicated with the transfer of parties, that there were some people who said, look, we moved the inauguration from March 4th to January 20th because it was seen in the 20th century that there was no longer such a long need for this huge lag for people to travel, for instance, and the like. So we made it January 20th. But now the transition process has become so complicated. Maybe we need to start thinking about moving it back again, because as we've seen this year, this is going to be a very sudden process. And I think you hear a lot of people in the new administration saying, we have to hit the ground with our feet running, and I'm not sure we can do it.
Well, certainly when when you take into account the kind of the scope of American history since the Revolution, we've really, as a nation, have been through some dangerous existential moments as a democracy. Do you think 2020, 2021 is one of those moments? In other words, as we look at the events of the last week and take into account the history that we've had as a nation, is this just a hiccup in our democracy, or do you think it's a existential threat?
I want to apologize before I give this answer. I'm going to give such a historian answer to this question, but it's the one that I think is honest. I think historians. I'm sorry.
That's where we're paying you the big
Yeah,
bucks.
exactly. I think historians look for trends, and one event is always hard in the moment to understand. And so if in 4 years or in 8 years or whatever happens in the future, if it becomes the norm that people dispute elections, that the electoral vote gets challenged, that if this becomes the norm, then I think we will say this has been a moment where we turned a path, and maybe this is the beginning of an existential crisis of the health of democracy. If in 4 years we go back to the old pattern of people, even in these horrific times, I think back to what Al Gore did in 2000. He lost an election by a few hundred votes in Florida. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. He lost on a very close vote. And then he said it's over, and he conceded, and he stepped aside, and he was gracious. If we go back to that norm, then this will just be a blip. And so I think the problem is, I think historians often want to get a little distance before they try to say we're in the midst of a crisis. Now, I have to say, I also want to hedge my answer based on what happens next Wednesday, because the storming of the Capitol shook me. There's no question. That was an unprecedented attempt to subvert the democratic process. And if there's another such attempt next Wednesday, then I would be much more willing to go on record saying, yes, I think we've reached an existential crisis. But if, as I think many of us hope, the temperature continues to get turned down, then I think we'll just see this as a very unfortunate moment that we have passed through, as we've passed through many other really tremendously difficult moments.
Thanks, Dr. Barker. And it looks like we have another audience question. Luke, would you mind sharing that?
Sure. Is there any discussion about shortening the time between election and the swearing in of the next president?
I think, as I said in an earlier answer, it might just be the opposite. It's such a complex process to hand the power over because of the complexity of the executive branch, that there's probably not much energy for that. I think the other problem, as we've seen in this election cycle, is the thing you don't want to do is get to Inauguration Day and not have a clear decision in the Electoral College. That was a worry they had back in 1876 and 1877 that I alluded to earlier. The so-called Wormley House bargain, which is what the deal that led to the compromise of 1877, was not hammered out until the last day of January. And so in our current election cycle, they would have gotten to January 20th without an electoral vote certified. And so I think what we want to avoid is that is the moment where the question would become, well, who is the president of the United States? And I think that's what we want to avoid at all costs. So it usually seems like it takes a long time, but this cycle, it seemed a little shorter. I also say when a president gets elected, they also have to figure out who's going to be in their cabinet and who they're going to fill a lot of positions with. We saw Joe Biden doing this in this cycle. It's not just one announcement, it's a series of announcements. And I don't know that an incoming president would want to shorten that process much up either.
Thanks, Dr. Barker. I was paying attention a little bit to the news yesterday, and one of the reporters was saying that advisors to President Trump are and have been encouraging him to get out in the public and kind of give, I don't know what you would call it, a closing speech, sort of a wrap up, and which they were, saying might do well to help his legacy, right? So, and he can share, the accomplishments that he had done, as many presidents do. And at least to my knowledge, he's been a little reluctant to do that. So I want to get to a question about legacy. And especially in the case of President Trump, because now he is the first president ever to have been impeached twice. And so beyond the novelty of that fact, right, that's very unusual, completely unprecedented, do you think that fact will be significant to the long-term legacy of how we view President Trump?
Yeah, I think, again, what I would say is I think a lot of that depends on what happens in the coming months, whether he is in fact convicted by the Senate for this one, and also whether he finds further legal trouble down the road. Because I think there are two scenarios here, each of which seems likely to me in different ways. This is an important moment. As you said, it is unprecedented that a president's been impeached twice. And I think that if he continues to have trouble and his legacy continues to be hurt in that way, we may see this as something that really shows the beginning of the downfall of his legacy. If he somehow survives this and comes back, then I think the two impeachments will be put down to the larger partisan atmosphere of the times in which we live. And the blame will be shared amongst everyone, sort of the Democratic Congress and the Republican president. So I think that the jury is still out on that. I think we'll have to see. By the way, I think that his advisors are dead right. There is nothing, Teddy Roosevelt called it the bully pulpit, right? There is a power of what you can say and the way in which you can shape not only your image, but the trajectory of the nation by what you say as president. And so, yes, I think he should not give up this moment as a chance to try to define his legacy leaving the office. And I think that he should think long and hard about what he wants to say and what he wants to leave as sort of his benediction on the presidency, because that will help define the way he leaves the office, I think. And I think it's always important. Washington made a famous farewell address. Some others have made much less formal statements, but I think it is the last moment because forget all the controversy about him being banned from social media and the like. The reality is once you're not president anymore, you don't have as many ears. He's still going to have a loyal following. I'm not suggesting that, but you do not have the same attention you have as president. And I think this is his last moment to begin to try to define the legacy of what his presidency meant.
Wow, thank you so much. A lot of great information and insight as usual. We're so grateful for you as a guest on our show again, and the first repeat guest in Two Bald Guys history.
Hey.
So thank you so much. Hey, before you go, I understand you're giving a quote unquote Hank talk. I'm not sure what that is, but you're giving that in February. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or our viewers a little bit about that?
Sure. So the UWSP at Wausau mascot is Hank the Husky. Many people don't know his name's Hank, but he is named Hank. And so this is faculty members are giving talks similar in some ways to TED Talks on topics of the day. And I'm going to do the first one of those on Tuesday, February 16th at 7 p.m. And it's going to be called Why Slavery Caused the Civil War and Why That Matters Today More Than Ever. And so it's meant to be sort of lively and brief and get to the point. And I'm going to be talking about the connections between the past and the role that race played in the Civil War and the way that continues to sort of hound us as a society and the connections with today. So I encourage people to tune into that, and there'll be other ones coming up, and they'll be advertised. If you go to uwsp.edu/Wausau and look under the Lecture and Arts tab, there will be a Hank's Talk tab there pretty soon, and you can follow that and find out where you can find that in this time where everything tends to be virtual.
Thanks, and we'll put some information on our Facebook page about that when that's available. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, that incredible plug that we gave you has meant that we've run out of time for our usual guest, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. So we apologize to him. that we'll have to have him on next week. So sorry about that, Dwayne. In the meantime, I want to wish everybody a happy new year, and especially to you, Luke and Dave, and to all of our viewers.
And same to you, Eric. And thank you again, Dr. Barker, for being with us. I love it when history and current affairs intersect, and we have an opportunity to talk about those parallels and things that are paralleled and things that aren't necessarily parallel. So thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to encourage our viewers to be sure to tune in next week, where we'll be discussing the 2021 Wisconsin legislative agenda with two representatives from the Wisconsin State Senate, both one from a Democratic perspective and one from a Republican perspective. So I think that's going to be an interesting discussion as well. So happy New Year, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.